Hello, dear learners. Welcome to teaching learning session of sociology. We are discussing BSOE 134 methods of sociological inquiries. In our last lecture, we discussed about the comparative studies of Emile Durkheim and Max Weber, Radcliffe Brown, and various other sociologists. Today, in the lecture series, we'll discuss about feminist perspective for research. The study of gender began in 1970. Prior to 1970s, there was little or no work on gender. Sociologists till almost the 20th century did not focus on gender as an important aspect of society. Before 1970s, there were no studies, no exclusive studies on the gender. After 1970s or in 1970s, there was a little work, or sociologists started working on gender studies. It was almost as if society was constituted only by men. It was assumed before 1970s that any study of men in society automatically included women. Gendered aspect of society, whether in terms of institutions or roles, were unquestioned. No one inquired about the gendered aspects of society. No sociologist or anthropologist thought of to take interest in gendered studies. Gender was assumed to be a part of the natural order of things. This rendered gender invisible in study of men. Emergence of the feminist methodology challenged this way of studying society. In 1970s, when the feminist approach emerges, it challenged the way of studying society. As if before 1970s, it was considered that the society is composed of men and study of men automatically included women. In the initial phases, it emerged as a critic to a positivist epistemology that prevailed in social sciences. As we all know, what is positivist approach? Emile Durkheim, Auguste Comte were of positive approach. They were from the positive school. In initial phases, this feminist approach emerged as a critique to positivist epistemology. They criticized the positivist approach. It questioned the way that gender had largely ignored, studied, and presented by positivists. They argued that almost aspects of society include a gendered perspective. The proponents of the feminist methodology argued for methodology that made the gendered aspect of society visible. The values of rationality, freedom from religious dogma, ideas of progress, and linking of a progress with capitalism were the main themes that dominated sociology. The main area or the focus area of study of sociology before 1970s or before this feminist approach, before the rise of this feminist approach, were rationality. Max Weber talked about rationality, freedom from religious dogma, period of Renaissance, ideas of progress and linking of progress with capitalism. They were the main focus study area for sociologists. They ignored gender studies and feminist sociologists criticized this. The first set of scholars who began studying society used the positivist approach. Positivism in social sciences were led by theorists such as Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim. What is the positivist approach? Positivist approach is the scientific way of studying society. According to positivist, we can study society as per the laws of natural sciences. As we study the natural sciences, on the same line we can study society. They emphasized on the objectivity. And Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim were the social scientists who were of the positivist approach. The positivists believed that it was important to study the society from a scientific perspective. They worked with the vision to formulate universal laws for study of society. According to them, as in natural sciences, we can formulate the universal laws. Similarly, we can formulate the universal laws for study of society. We can study the society objectively according to positivists. Social structure were seen as comparable to natural world. They compared the social sciences or social structure with the natural world. According to them, we can toe the line of natural sciences. It was believed that the methods of natural sciences could be applied to study society. The task of positivist was to study social facts. Their focus was on objectivity, reliability, and validity. They focused on the objectivity. According to positivist, we can study society objectively as we can study natural sciences. Their focus was on reliability and validity. That is, reliability and validity means we can generalize the results, universalizes the results. They believed that they were studying society in a neutral, impartial manner. According to them, if we study society objectively, then it means we are studying the society in a natural and impartial manner. Others, sociologists and thinkers like Max Weber, were critical to positivists. Weber studied society through methods of subjective interpretation and worsening. According to him, we can study society only through subjective interpretation, through social actions. by subjectively studying the individual or the society. We cannot study society objectively. He emphasized on the subjective interpretation and Wordsworth method. He believed that the method of natural sciences were not appropriate for the study of society. We cannot study society based on the basis of natural sciences. We cannot apply the methods of natural sciences on society. For him, sociological study was value free in the sense that its rationality was defined by the community of social scientists and cultural prevailing at that time. For Weber, choice of the subject matter for research was not value free. Although, according to Weber, we can study society unbiasedly, but that the choice of the subject cannot be value free. It depends on the values of researcher. The subject of choice depends on the value of the researcher. Then once the choice was made, then the study was done in a value free manner. But the choice of the subject depends on the value of the researcher. The subject matter chosen for research in the Weberian sense would be influenced by the prevailing norms of the research. Thus, objectivity for Weber in social sciences would be determined by ontological orientation of the researcher themselves. So, Weber studied society through subjective interpretation or Wordsworth methods. According to him, we cannot study society objectively. The study of society could be value free, but this choice of the subject matter cannot be value free. It depends on the values of the researcher. Weber's vision of a value free social sciences was flawed. The feminists argued that ontology of researcher determined the choice of the topic of research because the choice of the topic of research depends on the values of a researcher. So, according to feminists, the Weber version of value free social sciences was flawed. Since gender was almost invisible in research, this meant that epistemology of social sciences itself was based on a falsely value free premise. The interpretation of social action was also based on this flawed version of reality shared by the researcher and the research subject. So, because of these points, according to feminist sociologist, the Weber's study was flawed. The critic of the dominant androcentric methodologies. Feminist methodology was critical of this vision of society. They criticized endocentric methodologies. Progress in society was attributed to development of rational human thoughts. According to sociologists, because of the rationality or because of the rational thoughts, the society progresses. The default understanding was that it is assumed that human beings were represented by one. It assumed that human beings and those who contributed to development of society were men and their brotherhood. Women were absent. They had a very little to say on the issues related to gender. Majority of sociologists studied about the institutions, about the religious dogma, about the capitalism, but the gender studies were absent from their studies, from their, nor did they have much to say on the impact of these changes on women. The universal idea of progress and thought was limited to the universal of men only because, according to them, this includes all the genders. The criticism of the dominant positivist methodology prevalent in social sciences has been at the several level. The positivist approach was critiqued for its emphasis on value free objectivity. They criticized the positivist approach because of its value free objectivity. The dominance of the reason, rationality, and empiricism in the 19th century had a false premises of objectivity. Women were excluded from research. The view on the views on women of the leading thinker at that point were biased. They studied about the progress of society, and according to them, women contributed a lot in the progress of society. They excluded women from their research. They never included women in their research. They never talked about the impact of changes of society on women or the contribution of the women in society. Thinkers like Jean Jacques Ross and Kant deemed women to be a weaker sex. According to Kant, Ross, and Jean Jacques, women is a weaker sex. Women were positioned on the other side of truth, rationality, and science. Institutionalization of such thoughts and expertise also meant that this view of society become legitimate and authoritative. The feminists argued that this was just a perceived objectivity and did not constitute a value free research. Value free research means value free research means that there is no place for your perception. But as per sociologists like Kant, Ross, women is a weaker sex and they placed women on the other side. And feminists argued that it was just a perceived objectivity of it is a perception of researcher, and when the perception of researcher is there, then how the research could be value free? So it is not a value free research. There was artificial division between the mind and the body. Rene Descartes' work in the 17th century was turning point in terms of studying the world. He focused on the world around through reason and mind and not institutions and emotions. Sociologists emphasized on the institutions and emotions, while Rene Descartes emphasized on the reason and mind. This Cartesian dualism believed in separation of mind and matter. It became a part of Western common sense. It was believed that men were master of their mind. They were rational and could master their mind. As opposed to this, women were considered to be passionate and more in tune with their emotions. It means men can control their mind. They can master their mind, but women are emotional. They are more tuned. Women are more tuned with their emotions. The impact of this Cartesian dualism was that scientific investigation focused on the external observable world. They started focusing on just external observable world. No importance was given to the mind, that is thought and emotions. The feminist researchers claimed that Cartesian's classification of women was unreasonable and was biased. The feminist said that vision itself was socially constituted. Women are emotional. This is socially constituted sentence. Women is a weaker sex. This is socially constituted. Because we perceived that women are emotional or is a weaker sex. So according to feminist, this dualism is biased because it was socially constituted. It totally depends on the perception of the society or of the intellectuals. They argued that the validity of knowledge and even the research question asked were androcentric. Theorists like Harding and Smith pointed out the masculine bias in social sciences. They argued that focus of research has been on Western categories of reason and rationality as opposed to emotions. The focus on official, public, visible ways of functioning and not on the informal system indicated a masculine bias. According to Harding and Smith, the researcher focused on the Western categories of reason, not on the emotions. They focused on the official, public, and the visible way of functioning, not on the informal system. While the informal system of functioning plays an important role in society, they argued that traditional epistemologies have excluded the voice of women. Science and history have been written purely from a masculine perspective. They ignored women. The subject of traditional sociological analysis has always been a man. Such a science, they argued, was unreflective because they just included men and excluded women. The masculine bias meant that the feminine point of view was assumed to be part of the humanist perspective. According to them, this masculine was biased. Why it was biased? Because the feminine point of view was assumed to be a part of the humanist or the masculine perspective. They just assumed it. They never bothered to research or collect data about the feminist perspective, or they never studied about women. They assumed it. So it is flawed, it is biased. This was called a gynocentric methodology of 1970s and 80s. Feminist research methodology developed an understanding that it was difficult to understand women through male categories. By studying masculine characters or by studying men, you cannot say that we can universalize the results. It is difficult to understand women through male categories. There was a need to rethink on categories too. Feminists like Smith argued that sociology was unreflective and presented women from the standpoint of men who were the ruling class. As we all know, men are the ruling class, and according to Smith, the sociology was unreflective and always presented women from the point of view of ruling class, that is men. They never studied the point of view of women separately before 1970s. Smith argued that male social universe included only a set of issues specific to men like industrial sociology, social stratification, political sociology, etc. This marginalized women because majority of sociologists studied industrial sociology. They discussed about industrial sociology, they discussed about the political sociology, they discussed about the social stratification, and this marginalized the women. They never talked about the factors affecting women or the role of women in society. Mainstream anthropology focused on the men's activity rather than issues like child rearing or domestic violence or women's participation in a workforce. They ignored these issues. The feminists also argued that this sort of objective approach led to objectification of those being researched. According to feminists, this objective perspective, this objective research objectifies those who are under research or are being studied. The researched were treated as object and were not given any agency. The relationship of the researcher and the researched was a hierarchical one. The researcher was the knower who imposed their own categories of thought on being researched. According to feminists, this is not a value free research, this is a biased research. Why? Because this subjectivity objectifies those who are under study. This develops a hierarchical approach. The researcher was the knower who imposed their own categories on the researched, those who are being researched. who are under study. The researcher appear as a knower who knows everything and the researched as the known. Often the categories of thought that is imposed on the research subject are those of the researcher. Researcher imposed his or her categories on the researched subject. Researcher appears to be knower as if he knows everything. The practical difficulty in doing research in which the subject is treated as a thing also leads to the production of a false kind of knowledge. Because it could happen that the researcher might not give the right answers. Those who are being researched often do not share their true experiences. They could hide their experiences, their true feelings. The power relationship between the researcher and the researched is in some way done away with the feminist methodology. Harding and Smith argue for the need to place the researcher on the same plane as the researched. There should be no hierarchy between the researcher and the researched, according to the Harding and Smith, that the researcher and researched should be placed on the same plane. If you want to study unbiasedly, if you want to universalize your results, the feminists proposed a phenomenological, ethnomethodological, and interactionist approach in which women's experience mattered. According to feminists, this objectivity is not the right method to study. We should study. We should apply ethnomethodological approach, phenomenological, and interactional approach in which women's experience matter. They focused on the interaction, subjective interpretation. They advocated the use of the qualitative method as opposed to the quantitative method. Positivists emphasized on the quantitative method, and feminists advocated for the qualitative method as opposed to the quantitative method. As we all know that phenomenology, interactionist approach, and ethnomethodology all are the qualitative methods in which we try to understand the actions and reactions of the individual and the society, why someone is doing something. This method was based on identifying with subject rather than objectifying them. According to them, objectifying the subject under study is not correct method, but we should identify those under study. Focus should not be on structure of societies but on the processes. According to feminists, that the focus of sociologists should be on the processes rather than the structure of the society, while according to positivists, they studied about the social stratification, they studied about the structure of the society. The concept should be generated within the field itself and should not be predefined. We discussed about the facts, theories, right? According to objective study, that our study should be based on some theories or some concepts. But according to feminists, that concept should be generated within the field. It should not be based on the some predefined concepts. This would also give voice to the researched. The researchers should build from their experiences of everyday world. If our study is based on the pre-developed concepts or predefined concepts, then the voice of the researched, this undermines the voice of the researched. But if the concept is generated within the field, this gives the voice to the researched. The methodology used should be experiential and inductionist rather than deductive. We use deductive methodology in objective study, but according to feminists, that methodological should be experiential or inductionist. There was a need for generating concepts within the field rather than working with the preconceived or predefined concepts. This was in direct contrast to the androcentric methodologies prevalent in the social sciences. Emerging from women's liberation movement of 1960s and 70s, feminist theorists argued that there was need to do research from the standpoint of women. The aim was to create a space for women's research and to raise consciousness. Western feminist scholars started incorporated women in their studies of history, literature, philosophy, and other social sciences in 1970s. A conscious effort was also made to study women. The study of women, their achievement, become institutionalized in several women studies departments in West. After 1970s, the study of women become institutionalized in several women studies department in West. In West, various women studies development, the studies departments started. Its values were those of equality and androgyny. They insisted that women were as capable as men. Women is not a weaker sex. The standpoint theorists argue that without acknowledging the social location of the researcher, the knowledge that is presented as universal is incorrect. Right? Why it is incorrect? The standpoint, according to this standpoint theorist, it is very important to acknowledge the social location because, as per Weber, the choice of the subject depends on the values of the researcher. And the standpoint theorist also agree with this that it is very important to acknowledge the social location of the researcher because the research cannot be value free. The value neutrality of social sciences was biased and skewed. As I told you, it cannot be value free, right? So, according to standpoint theorist, it is very important to acknowledge the social location of the researcher because the neutrality of science was skewed and biased. Standpoint theorists believe that understanding women's experience is fundamental to understanding the realities. If you really want to understand the realities of the women, then it is very important to understand the women's experiences. They argue that research should be from all point of views. They contended that point of view of white, heterosexual, upper and middle class research is extremely skewed. According to standpoint theorist, if you are universalizing the results of study on the basis of white, heterosexual, upper and middle class, then the research is extremely skewed and biased. The conditions of white women and black women could be totally different. Their place in the society could be different. So you cannot universalize the results. If you are universalizing the result, then that research is skewed, not unbiased. It is biased research. So according to standpoint theorist, the point of view of the white, heterosexual, and upper and middle class research is extremely skewed. Standpoint theorists like Nancy Hartstock believe the Marxist idea of truth is historically specific and all knowledge is political. According to Nancy Hartstock, that truth is historically specific and knowledge is political. This is the point of view of Marx. We discussed about this in detail while we were discussing about Karl Marx. She contends that position of women in society and the sexual division of labor means that the lives of women differ from the lives of men. You cannot generalize the results on the basis of study of men. There, the lives of women is totally different from the lives of women. The patriarchal vision of gender structure, material relationship between men and women. Post-modernist critics, feminist knowledge production since 1980s on the ground of focus of epistemological assumption of rationality, objectivity, and value neutrality. According to a postmodernist critic, research is never bias free. Research is always biased. Postmodern thought, as developed by Derrida, Foucault, and has had been powerful impact on feminist methodology. So, according to Derrida and Foucault, their research is never biased free, and they had a powerful impact. Derrida and Foucault had a powerful impact on feminist methodology. So let's sum up this feminist perspective. Before 1970s, there were little or no studies on gender basis. There was no studies on the women. Most of the anthropologists or sociologists studied about social structure, about social institutions. At that time, before 1970s, the positivist approach was there. Positivist approach was to study the society scientifically or objectively. In 1970s, the feminists were of different opinion. According to them, this objective method of studying society is not correct. You cannot universalize the results where there is no place for women or on the basis of studies of men, because The experiences of men and women is totally different. To generalize the result, it is very important to include and the women to include women in research. According to them, this objective method of study is not the right way to study society. Rather than objectivity, they emphasized on ethnomethodology, social interaction, and phenomenology. Rather than implementing the quantitative method according to feminist sociologists, the qualitative method of research is important. Modern, postmodern critics like Derrida and Foucault, according to them, that research is never biased free, and they had a powerful impact on feminist methodology. Quantitative methods of inquiry. As I told you, the feminist, according to a feminist sociologist, that the quantitative method is not right way to study society. Rather than the quantitative method, qualitative method should be implemented. Now, what is quantitative method and what is the qualitative method of inquiry? We'll discuss about the quantitative method first. What is the quantitative method of inquiry? Quantitative research, the presumed assumptions are tested by setting up a tentative statement or hypothesis that is either supported or nullified. See, in quantitative method or in quantitative research, we test a presumed assumption. How we test a presumed assumption? By setting up a hypothesis. That hypothesis is either supported or nullified. What is hypothesis? First of all, understand what is hypothesis. Hypothesis is educated guess. That is perception of the researcher. On the basis of pre-developed theories or concepts, researcher develop a hypothesis or researcher develops a conception or makes a statement on the basis of that concept, pre-developed concept and theories. This is hypothesis. And in quantitative hypothesis, in quantitative research, this assumption or hypothesis will try to either support or nullify this hypothesis or perception or guess on the basis of the number or the data we collect from the subjects under study. This test, hypothesis test, is done through the data collected, which finally decides the fate of hypothesis. In quantitative data, we collect the data from the subjects under study. And on the basis of that data, we finally decides the fate of our hypothesis or our conception, pre-developed conception. An objective measurement with high quality of reliability and validity is designed to collect data. How we collect the data? There are various instruments available to collect the data. We collect the data with an instrument which is of high quality of reliability and validity. What is reliability and what is validity? Reliability is, as the uh, self reliability is self explanatory, on which we can rely. That what we are getting, the results, what data we are getting is of correct. And validity is, uh, if we apply the same instrument n number of times on n number of group, we'll get the same result. Or if we will apply the instrument, same instrument n number of times on the same group, then again we'll get the same results. That is the validity of the instrument. It is very important that your instrument for data collection should be reliable and valid. What is reliable? That you should get the required data only. That is the reliability of the data. Validity is, if you are applying the same instrument to n number of groups, then you should get the same results. Or if you are applying the same instrument n number of times to the same group, then again there should be no deviation from the results. So you can measure or get the data with the help of reliable and valid instrument. After collecting the data, the information is analyzed using statistical procedures and hypothesis testing. First of all, we develop a hypothesis on the basis of pre-developed concept in quantitative methodology, right? The researcher goes through literature review, and on the basis of that literature review, he developed an hypothesis. On the basis of that hypothesis, he develops an instrument, reliable and valid instrument to collect the data. After collection of data, that data was analyzed using statistical procedures. There are various statistical procedures available, right? We apply the statistical procedures on the data and analyze that data and test our hypothesis key, what our assumption, or whether our assumption or hypothesis is correct or not. The researcher tests a theory of specifying narrow hypothesis and collection of data to support or refute the hypothesis. And on the basis of these tests, we either accept our hypothesis or reject our hypothesis. This is the quantitative method. Quantitative research gained ground mainly in the 19th and 20th century. The main purpose of quantitative research is to investigate the causal relationship between variables. What is the main aim of quantitative method? The main aim is to develop or to investigate the causal relationship between the variable. Is there any relationship between the variable? Like, let me explain it with an example. If I say that there is an is there any relationship between the examination and the stress level of the student? I want to check out if there is any relationship between the examination and the uh, entrance examination, or any of the examination and the stress level of the student. According to me, there is no relationship, no significant relationship between the examinations and the stress level. Whether there is an examination or not, students are not stressed, right? I want to test this. The main purpose is to find out the relationship. Is there any relationship between the examination and the stress level of the student? Then we can apply this quantitative research. The purpose of quantitative research is to investigate the causal relationship. between the variables. So I have two variables, one is examination and other is student. I want to check out if there is any relationship between the two variables. Statistical data collection is insisted through advocate selection of observed behaviors of the sample. It is very important in quantitative method that we should collect the data from the advocate samples. Now, what is sample? When I am studying, when the example which I have taken is stress and the student. The student is a variable under study. Suppose I want to, this student is a population for my studies, right? All the students, suppose there could be the lakhs of students or crores of students. I cannot study all the students to find out the relationship, right? So I have to take these samples. Sample means a bunch. Sample means I'll select few few students from the student population to study, right? This is sample. There are various methods to find out the sample size. How can I select the sample? I cannot select the sample randomly. I cannot select the sample as per my wish. There are the various ways to select the sample, the probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Which technique I apply, that depends on my studies. So it is very important that we should observe the behavior of the samples of the population under study. We should take out some samples from the population under study and we should study those samples. We should collect the data from those samples. The data analysis is usually done in numerically objective form, and when after collecting the data has been analyzed. Researchers should analyze the data in numerically objective form. We'll continue with this quantitative research methods in our next lecture. Till then, thank you very much. Namaskar.